Milo Hartwell had worked with enough people to stop believing first impressions. In his experience, the most charming employees often cause the biggest problems, while the quiet ones could surprise everyone. That lesson had cost him years of trust and more than one career setback, which was why he had developed a habit that most people would probably find strange. He watched. He paid attention. He listened when nobody realized he was listening. As the operations manager of one of the city's fastest-growing event management companies, Milo spent most of his days solving problems before anyone else even noticed they existed. He was respected, successful, and known for keeping a cool head under pressure. What most people didn't know was that he trusted almost nobody. That morning started like any other. The company was preparing for its biggest corporate event of the year, a project worth millions and important enough that every department was under pressure. Deadlines were approaching, clients were demanding changes every few hours, and everyone seemed to be operating on caffeine and stress. Milo stepped out of a meeting room and immediately heard raised voices coming from the operations floor. A young intern named Ethan stood beside a workstation, looking completely panicked. Several printed schedules were spread across the desk, and Natalie Cross stood across from him with her arms folded. "You mixed up the vendor timelines," Natalie said sharply. "Do you realize how much trouble this creates?" "I'm sorry. I thought I had updated the correct version." "You thought?" Natalie laughed without humor. "That's not going to help when the client asks why everything is delayed." Several employees nearby pretended to focus on their work while quietly watching. Ethan looked like he was about 2 seconds away from quitting on the spot. Then another voice entered the conversation. "Actually, it's not just his mistake." Everyone turned. Nolan Mercer walked over carrying a tablet. Natalie frowned. "What are you talking about?" Nolan placed the tablet on the desk and opened a file. "The version he used came from a folder I organized yesterday. I labeled one of the drafts incorrectly. If we're assigning blame, part of it belongs to me." Ethan immediately shook his head. "No, that's not true." Nolan stopped him. "We can figure out responsibility later. Right now, we should fix the schedule before the client notices." Natalie looked annoyed. "You don't need to protect him." "I'm not protecting him. I'm solving the problem." The room fell quiet. Milo remained several feet away, unnoticed. He watched Nolan spend the next 30 minutes reorganizing timelines, calling vendors, and fixing the issue without complaining once. He never tried to make himself look good. He never pointed fingers. He simply handled the situation. Most employees would have been focused on avoiding blame. Nolan seemed focused only on helping. Milo found himself paying attention. Later that afternoon, another crisis arrived. One of their VIP corporate clients demanded a complete redesign of a major presentation area less than 48 hours before the event. The request was unreasonable. Everyone knew it. Marcus Vaughn from sales immediately started arguing with the client during a video call. That only made things worse. The client became angry. The meeting quickly spiraled. Milo was about to intervene when Nolan quietly requested permission to speak. The client agreed. For the next 15 minutes, Nolan listened more than he talked. He asked questions. He acknowledged frustrations. He proposed alternatives. By the end of the conversation, the client not only agreed to keep the original timeline, but actually apologized for losing his temper. When the call ended, several employees looked genuinely impressed. Marcus looked irritated. Natalie looked even more irritated. Milo said nothing, but he noticed. For the rest of the week, he kept noticing. Nolan stayed late to help coworkers. Nolan covered shifts when people had family emergencies. Nolan trained new hires without being asked. Most importantly, he never acted differently when managers weren't around. That detail mattered to Milo more than anything, because people could fake kindness when they wanted something. It was much harder to fake it when nobody was watching. 3 days later, Milo and Nolan were assigned to travel together for a 4-day business trip. The event venue was several hours away, and they needed to inspect locations, coordinate vendors, and oversee final preparations. The drive to the destination was productive, mostly professional, mostly work. But Milo noticed that talking with Nolan felt easier than talking with most people. There were no hidden agendas. No attempts to impress him. No careful manipulation. Just honest conversation. They arrived at the venue, spent 2 exhausting days solving problems, and somehow managed to keep everything on schedule. By the final evening, everyone was exhausted. A storm rolled through the area just as they finished their last meeting. The company arranged transportation back to the hotel. Milo sat in the back seat. Nolan sat beside him. The rain hammered against the windows. Streetlights flashed by outside. The long week finally seemed to catch up with everyone. Milo leaned back and closed his eyes. At first, he intended to rest for a few minutes. Then an old habit surfaced. A habit he had never completely abandoned. He stayed still, kept his eyes closed, and listened. Not because he expected Nolan to do something wrong. Not exactly. But because part of him always wondered who people became when they thought nobody important was watching. The car continued through the rain. Several minutes passed. Then the air conditioning became noticeably colder. Milo heard Nolan shift slightly in his seat. Another minute passed. Then something warm settled across his shoulders. An extra layer. A jacket. Milo remained completely still. Nolan had taken off his own coat. Milo knew because he had seen him wearing it earlier. The younger man carefully adjusted the fabric to make sure it covered him properly. No dramatic gesture. No audience. No expectation of recognition. Just a simple act of kindness. A few moments later, Nolan leaned forward toward the driver. Could you lower the air conditioning a little? Sure. And maybe take the next route through downtown. It's a few minutes longer, but the roads are smoother. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. You worried about your boss waking up? Nolan smiled. Something like that. The driver laughed softly. Most people would want to get back faster. Most people aren't running on 3 hours of sleep. Milo nearly opened his eyes. Instead, he stayed still. The conversation continued. He always works this hard? The driver asked. Too hard. You too close. There was a brief pause. Then Nolan answered. Not really. The response surprised Milo more than it should have. But he's a good manager, Nolan continued. People think he's cold because he's strict. Honestly, I think he's just carrying more responsibility than anyone realizes. The driver nodded. You respect him. Ido. Another silence followed. Then Nolan looked out the rain-covered window. And I think he deserves better than most of the people around him. Milo felt something strange settle in his chest. For years, he had heard employees compliment him directly. That never meant much. People often said what they thought management wanted to hear. This was different. Nolan thought he was asleep. There was no benefit in saying any of it. The car continued through the storm. Eventually, the conversation ended. The city lights grew closer. The hotel was only minutes away. Milo opened his eyes for the first time in nearly half an hour. Nolan had turned toward the window and hadn't noticed. For a moment, Milo simply looked at the jacket draped across his shoulders. Then he looked at Nolan, and for the first time in a very long time, he found himself genuinely curious about someone. Not as an employee, not as a problem to solve, not as a responsibility, as a person. The car finally pulled into the hotel entrance. Nolan turned back just as Milo straightened in his seat. You awake? Looks like it. Nolan smiled. Good. We made it. Milo held the jacket for a second before handing it back. You should probably keep this. Nolan accepted it. Thanks. Neither of them mentioned what had happened during the drive. Neither mentioned the coat. Neither mentioned the conversation. But as they walked toward the hotel entrance together, Milo found himself watching Nolan disappear through the revolving doors ahead of him. And for the first time since joining the company, he wasn't thinking about deadlines, budgets, clients, or upcoming meetings. He was wondering why one employee's quiet act of kindness felt more important than anything else that had happened all week. And without realizing it, Milo had already started paying attention in a way that would change everything. The next morning, Milo told himself he had no reason to keep thinking about the jacket. It had been a simple gesture. A kind one, certainly, but still simple. Good employees did thoughtful things all the time. That was hardly enough to make someone stand out. Unfortunately, the more he tried not to think about it, the more he noticed Nolan. The final day of the business trip was packed with meetings. Vendors were arriving earlier than expected, equipment deliveries were running behind schedule, and a client representative kept changing his requests every few hours. By noon, everyone was frustrated. Milo spent most of the morning moving between conference rooms and phone calls. Every time he crossed the operations area, Nolan seemed to be in the middle of solving another problem. One vendor arrived with the wrong equipment. Nolan fixed it. A transportation company accidentally sent 2 buses to the wrong venue. Nolan fixed that too. A temporary staff member showed up without the required credentials. Again, Nolan handled it. What caught Milo's attention wasn't the fact that Nolan solved problems. Plenty of people could solve problems. It was how he treated people while doing it. No shouting, no blaming, no dramatic speeches. Just calm conversations and practical solutions. At one point, Milo watched a frustrated vendor apologize for a mistake that had cost everyone nearly 2 hours. Nolan simply smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. Let's focus on getting everything running again." The man looked visibly relieved. Most managers would have used the opportunity to make someone feel guilty. Nolan chose the faster path. Fix the issue and move on. By the time they returned to headquarters later that evening, the entire team was exhausted. The major event was only a few days away. Everyone knew the pressure would get worse before it got better. The following afternoon, that pressure finally exploded. One of the company's biggest clients requested an emergency meeting. The message arrived shortly after lunch. Nobody liked emergency meetings, especially not when the client sounded angry. Milo, Marcus, Natalie, Nolan, and several senior employees gathered inside a conference room while the client joined through video call. The moment the screen connected, the client launched into a complaint. A promotional installation scheduled for the event had apparently been delayed. Several materials had not arrived. The client wanted answers immediately. Marcus tried to explain. The client interrupted him. Marcus pushed back. The client became even angrier. Within minutes, the discussion turned into an argument. Milo watched the situation deteriorate. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize when his ego was taking control. Unfortunately, that moment had already arrived. The client accused the company of poor communication. Marcus accused the client of changing requirements. Neither side was listening anymore. The meeting was becoming a disaster. Then a quiet voice spoke. "Can I ask a question?" Everyone looked toward Nolan. The client looked annoyed. "What?" Nolan remained completely calm. "Can you show us the version of the delivery schedule your team received?" The client hesitated. "Then share the document." The moment it appeared on screen, Nolan spotted the issue. A previous draft had been sent by mistake. The wrong schedule had created confusion. The client thought equipment was arriving 3 days earlier than planned. The company believed the client had approved the updated version. Both sides had been working from different documents. The room became silent. Nolan carefully explained what had happened. He never blamed the client. He never blamed Marcus. He simply laid out the facts. Then he proposed a revised timeline. 15 minutes later, the problem was solved. The client actually thanked him before ending the call. As soon as the screen went dark, Marcus stood up. That should have been handled earlier. Nobody responded, because everyone knew who had almost made the situation worse. Milo looked across the table. Nolan was already collecting his notes, as if nothing unusual had happened. The younger man didn't seem interested in taking credit. That bothered Milo more than it should have. Not because he disliked it, because he respected it. And respect was becoming dangerous. That evening, most employees left the office late. Around 9 o'clock, Milo finally stepped out of his office intending to go home. Instead, he noticed light coming from the break room. Someone was still there. Curious, he walked over. Nolan sat alone at one of the tables eating instant noodles while staring at his laptop. Several spreadsheets covered the screen. Milo checked his watch. "You know it's 9 o'clock, right?" Nolan looked up and laughed softly. "Unfortunately. Why are you still here?" "I'm fixing a budget report. You could finish tomorrow." "I could. But then tomorrow would become even worse." Milo couldn't argue with that logic. For some reason, instead of leaving, he sat down across from him. Nolan looked surprised. "Working late too?" "Apparently." "That's not very encouraging." Milo actually smiled. A rare event. You're the one still eating instant noodles at 9 o'clock. That's because the vending machine stole my sandwich. Sounds tragic. It was. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The conversation felt unexpectedly comfortable. No meetings. No deadlines. No audience. Just two exhausted employees sharing a quiet moment. Eventually, Nolan closed his laptop. Can I ask you something? Milo raised an eyebrow. Depends. Why did you become an operations manager? The question caught him off guard. Most people asked about promotions or salary. Nobody ever asked why. After a moment, he answered honestly. I like solving problems. That's it. That's it. Nolan laughed. I don't believe you. Why not? Because nobody works the hours you work just because they like spreadsheets. Milo found himself looking away. There was probably some truth in that. I like knowing things won't fall apart if I'm paying attention. Nolan studied him for a second, then nodded. That sounds more believable. What about you? What about me? Why do you do this? Nolan leaned back in his chair. My dad owned a small restaurant when I was growing up. Milo listened. He always said that people remember how you make them feel long after they forget the details. I guess that stuck with me. What does that have to do with event management? Everything. Nolan smiled. A wedding, a conference, a charity gala. People forget the decorations eventually. They remember whether the experience felt good. The answer stayed with Milo because it explained so much. It explained why Nolan treated people the way he did, why he always prioritized relationships over blame, why everyone seemed to trust him. For the next week, Milo noticed himself seeking opportunities to work with Nolan. Not intentionally. At least that's what he told himself. But somehow their schedules kept overlapping. Meetings, site inspections, vendor calls, problem-solving sessions. The more time they spent together, the more difficult it became to maintain emotional distance. One afternoon, the company hosted a networking event for several partner organizations. Employees from different companies attended. Industry professionals moved from table to table, exchanging business cards and conversations. Milo arrived late after another meeting. As he entered the room, his eyes immediately landed on Nolan. That alone irritated him. What irritated him even more was who Nolan was talking to. A tall consultant from another event company stood beside him. The woman was attractive, confident, clearly interested. Milo watched them laugh together, then watched her touch Nolan's arm. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly lost interest in the networking event. A few minutes later, Natalie appeared beside him. Looks like Nolan is popular. Milo kept his expression neutral. I hadn't noticed. Really, her smile suggested she didn't believe him. The consultant has been talking to him for nearly half an hour. Milo took a sip of coffee. Good for them. Natalie studied him carefully, then walked away. Milo hated that conversation, mostly because he wasn't entirely sure why it annoyed him. The event continued. Eventually, the consultant handed Nolan a business card. The two exchanged another smile. Something unpleasant twisted inside Milo's chest. He immediately hated that feeling. It was irrational, unprofessional, and completely ridiculous. Nolan worked for him. That was all. Nothing more. Yet the rest of the evening seemed strangely longer than usual. When the event finally ended, employees began leaving. Milo was gathering his things when Nolan approached. You heading out? Eventually. Nolan held up the business card. The consultant from tonight offered me a position. Milo felt his stomach drop. What? Nolan laughed. Relax. I said no. The tension disappeared so quickly it almost made him dizzy. You turn it down? Of course. Why? Nolan looked genuinely confused. I like my job. Milo stared at him. Nolan continued. And honestly, I like the people here. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Nolan smiled. Besides, I think we're about to pull off the biggest event in company history. Seems like a bad time to leave. Before Milo could respond, Nolan waved and headed toward the elevator. The doors closed, and for several seconds Milo remained standing exactly where he was, because something had become impossible to ignore. The relief he had felt when Nolan rejected another opportunity had been far too strong, far too personal, far too dangerous. For the first time, Milo allowed himself to admit a truth he had been avoiding ever since that rainy night in the car. He wasn't simply impressed by Nolan anymore. He wasn't just paying attention, and he definitely wasn't acting like a manager observing a talented employee. Somewhere between the jacket, the late-night conversations, and 100 small acts of kindness, Nolan Mercer had become someone Milo looked for whenever he entered a room. And that realization frightened him far more than any problem waiting on his desk. The week after the networking event should have been focused entirely on work. The company's biggest event of the year was less than 2 weeks away, and every department was operating under intense pressure. Vendors were calling constantly, schedules were changing by the hour, and the executive team wanted updates on everything. Under normal circumstances, Milo would have been completely consumed by work. The problem was that Nolan kept finding ways into his thoughts. Not intentionally, not through dramatic gestures, just through the accumulation of small moments that became harder and harder to ignore. A few days after the networking event, Milo arrived at the office before 7 in the morning. He expected the building to be nearly empty. Instead, he found Nolan sitting in the break room with a laptop open and a cup of coffee beside him. "You know, most people aren't here yet," Milo said. Nolan looked up and smiled. "Unfortunately, the vendors don't seem to know that." "What happened?" 3 delivery companies updated their schedules overnight. Milo walked over. Nolan immediately turned the screen so he could see. For the next 20 minutes, they reviewed changes together. Neither of them noticed how naturally the conversation flowed. There was no awkwardness, no effort. They simply worked well together. At one point, Nolan leaned closer to show him a revised timeline. Their shoulders briefly touched. Neither man reacted immediately, but Milo definitely noticed. And judging by the way Nolan suddenly focused very hard on his screen, he had noticed too. The moment passed. Neither mentioned it. The problem was that moments like that kept happening. By the following week, they were spending more time together than ever. Site inspections, vendor meetings, budget reviews, client presentations. Every assignment, somehow, seemed to place them side by side. Natalie noticed. Marcus noticed too. Neither seemed pleased. One afternoon, Natalie entered Marcus's office and shut the door behind her. "This is getting ridiculous." Marcus looked up from his computer. "What is?" The two of them. Marcus already knew exactly who she meant. They're working on the same project. Natalie rolled her eyes. "That's not what I mean." Marcus leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Marcus smiled. A small smile. The kind that usually meant he was thinking about something dangerous. "Let them get comfortable." Natalie frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means people make mistakes when they stop being careful." Meanwhile, Milo and Nolan remained completely unaware of the conversation. They had bigger problems. 3 days before the event, a major supplier called with bad news. A transportation strike had delayed several deliveries. Important equipment might not arrive on time. The entire operations team immediately entered crisis mode. For nearly 12 hours, Milo and Nolan worked side by side, trying to find alternatives. Phone calls, emails, emergency meetings, backup vendors. By evening, they had solved most of the issue. Most, not all. Unfortunately, the remaining equipment needed to be inspected in person at another location nearly 3 hours away. The trip couldn't be postponed. Someone had to go. Milo volunteered immediately. Nolan volunteered before he finished speaking, which was how both men found themselves driving across the state together the following morning. The inspection itself went smoothly. The problems started afterward. A severe storm rolled into the area much faster than expected. Heavy rain reduced visibility. Several roads were temporarily closed. Traffic slowed to a crawl. By late evening, it became obvious they wouldn't make it back to the city. The company travel coordinator spent nearly an hour calling hotels. Everything nearby was fully booked. Finally, she found a small roadside resort with one available room. One room. For 2 people. The silence after hearing that information lasted several seconds. Then Nolan cleared his throat. "We can make it work." Milo nodded. Obviously, neither looked particularly comfortable. 2 hours later they arrived. The room was clean, large, and equipped with exactly one bed. A very large bed, but still one bed. Nolan set his bag down. Well. Another awkward silence followed. Then Nolan laughed. This is probably the most embarrassing travel arrangement in company history. I've seen worse. No, you haven't. Milo smiled despite himself. Eventually, they ordered takeout and settled into opposite ends of the room. For the first hour, they mostly talked about work, vendor problems, schedules, upcoming meetings, safe topics. Then the conversation gradually shifted. At some point, Nolan asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" Milo looked up from his phone. "That depends on the question." "Fair." Nolan considered his words. "Have you always been this serious?" Milo laughed. A genuine laugh. A rare one. "No. Really? What happened?" The answer came more easily than expected. Experience. Nolan waited. Milo continued. "I trusted the wrong people a few times. At work, mostly." He didn't elaborate. Nolan didn't push. That was another thing Milo appreciated about him. He respected boundaries. Several moments passed before Nolan spoke again. "I don't think you're as cold as people think." Milo raised an eyebrow. No. What gave me away?" Nolan grinned. "The fact that you secretly fix everyone else's mistakes before they become disasters. That's called management." "No, that's caring." The statement lingered in the room. Milo looked away first. The conversation moved on. Family, college stories, career mistakes, favorite movies. Hours passed without either of them noticing. Eventually midnight arrived. Then 1 o'clock. Neither seemed eager to end the conversation. For reasons neither fully understood, being together felt easy, comfortable, safe. Eventually Nolan stood. "We should probably sleep." "Probably." They prepared for bed. The situation immediately became awkward again. Both men tried very hard to act normal. Neither succeeded. Finally, they settled under opposite sides of the blanket with a considerable amount of space between them. The lights went off. Silence filled the room. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Neither was sleeping. Milo stared at the ceiling. Across the bed, Nolan shifted position. "You awake?" "Unfortunately." Nolan laughed quietly. "Same." Neither spoke for a while. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. Eventually, Nolan's voice broke the silence again. "Can I tell you something?" "Sure." "When I first started working here, I was terrified of you." Milo groaned. "Wonderful." "I'm serious." "Why?" "You never smiled." "I smile." "No." "You occasionally acknowledge humor." Despite himself, Milo laughed again. The sound seemed to surprise both of them. Then Nolan said something softer. "I was wrong about you." The room became quiet. "What do you mean?" "I thought you didn't care about people." Milo turned his head slightly. "And now?" "I think you care too much." For several seconds, neither moved. Neither spoke. Something about the darkness made honesty easier. Milo found himself saying things he normally wouldn't. "You're probably the first person who's ever accused me of that. Then everyone else isn't paying attention." The words settled somewhere deep inside him. Eventually, exhaustion began to win. Conversation faded. The room grew quiet. At some point during the night, Nolan fell asleep first. Milo wasn't far behind. Several hours later, another clap of thunder rolled through the area. Nolan shifted unconsciously, then shifted again. Without waking up, he moved closer. A few minutes later, his shoulder pressed lightly against Milo's. Milo opened his eyes. The room remained dark. For a moment, he considered moving away. Instead, he stayed still. Nolan continued sleeping peacefully. Another thunderclap echoed outside. This time, Nolan moved even closer. His head settled against Milo's shoulder. Still asleep. Still completely unaware. Milo's heart began beating much faster than it should have. He told himself to move. He didn't. Instead, after several long seconds, he carefully adjusted the blanket. Then, almost without thinking, he wrapped one arm lightly around Nolan. Not possessive. Not inappropriate. Just enough to make sure he didn't fall off the edge of the bed. The younger man relaxed instantly. as if he felt safe there. Milo stared into the darkness, unable to sleep, because for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. No deadlines. No responsibilities. No pressure. Just a quiet room. Rain outside. And someone he trusted resting against him. The realization frightened him almost as much as it comforted him. Eventually sleep won. Morning arrived faster than either of them wanted. Sunlight slipped through the curtains. Nolan stirred first. For several seconds, he remained completely still. Then realization hit. He was leaning against Milo, very closely, and Milo's arm was still around him. Both men froze. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The silence lasted several heartbeats. Finally, Nolan slowly looked up. Milo was already awake. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for both men to understand something important had changed. Not officially, not verbally, but something had shifted. The distance that once existed between manager and employee suddenly felt much smaller than before. Neither knew what to do with that realization. Neither knew where it might lead. But as they prepared to leave the hotel and continue their trip home, one thing had become impossible to deny. Whatever this was between them, it was no longer just friendship. And neither of them seemed capable of pretending otherwise. When Milo and Nolan returned from the business trip, neither of them talked about what had happened at the hotel. They didn't mention waking up in the same position. They didn't mention the long moment where neither had looked away. And they definitely didn't mention the fact that everything felt different afterward. The problem was that pretending became harder every day. The company's biggest event of the year was now only a few days away. Everyone was busy. Everyone was exhausted. In theory, that should have made it easier to focus on work. Instead, Milo found himself becoming increasingly distracted whenever Nolan entered a room. The younger man hadn't changed. He still helped everyone, still solved problems, still smiled at people when they were stressed. But now Milo noticed every little thing. And worse, he was beginning to suspect Nolan noticed him too. 3 days before the event, they spent nearly 14 straight hours working together. By midnight, most of the staff had gone home. Only a handful remained. Milo was reviewing logistics reports when a coffee cup appeared beside his laptop. He looked up. Nolan stood there. You've been staring at spreadsheets for 2 hours. I'm working. You're slowly becoming a spreadsheet. Milo shook his head. You should go home. So should you. Neither moved. Nolan finally sat down across from him. You know, for someone who claims to like solving problems, you're terrible at taking care of yourself. That's a strong accusation. I have evidence. For a few minutes they talked about nothing important. It was easy. Too easy. At some point the conversation faded and neither seemed in a hurry to leave. The office around them had become completely quiet. Then Nolan suddenly smiled. What? Milo asked. You know what I realized? No. The first time I met you, I thought you hated me. Milo nearly laughed. Why? You looked at me for 3 seconds and immediately handed me extra work. You were hired to do work. That's not the point. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Something unspoken passed between them. Neither was ready to name it, but both felt it. The following afternoon, the event finally began. Months of preparation came down to a single day. Hundreds of guests arrived. Executives filled the venue. Sponsors checked every detail. The pressure was enormous. Yet somehow everything worked. The schedules held. The presentations ran smoothly. The vendors delivered on time. Even unexpected problems were handled quickly. By evening, it was obvious. The event was a success. A massive success. Employees celebrated throughout the venue. For the first time in weeks, everyone seemed able to breathe. Especially Milo. Near the end of the night, he found Nolan standing alone near one of the outdoor terraces overlooking the city. The younger man looked exhausted, but happy. Milo walked over. You did good. Nolan laughed. That's probably the closest thing to a compliment you've ever given me. I compliment people. No. You occasionally approve of their existence. Milo actually smiled. Nolan noticed. And for a second, neither looked away. Then Milo said something unexpected. There's something I've never told you. Nolan's expression changed. What is it? Milo looked out over the city lights. For years, he had kept certain things locked away. But somehow talking to Nolan felt different. I wasn't asleep that night. Nolan frowned. What night? The ride back from the hotel. Understanding slowly appeared across his face. The jacket. Milo nodded. You knew. I knew. Nolan stared at him. You were awake the entire time? Most of it. For a moment, Nolan looked completely shocked. Then he groaned and covered his face. Oh my God. What? You heard me talking to the driver. Yes. That's embarrassing. It wasn't. Nolan laughed despite himself. Then his expression softened. So why didn't you say anything? Milo hesitated. The honest answer wasn't easy. Because I wasn't sure what to do with it. What does that mean? For several seconds, Milo remained silent. Then he finally answered. It had been a long time since someone did something kind for me when they thought nobody was watching. The joke disappeared from Nolan's face. The moment became more serious. Milo continued. I used to trust people too easily. Nolan listened carefully. Years ago, I promoted someone. I thought he was a friend. The memory still irritated him. He stole client information, blamed it on someone else, and nearly destroyed an entire department. Nolan frowned. Damn. After that, I stopped believing most people meant what they said. The younger man looked at him quietly. So that's why you're always watching everyone. Milo didn't answer. He didn't need to. Nolan already understood. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nolan said something simple. I'm sorry that happened. Milo looked at him. No judgment. No pity. Just sincerity. And somehow that made it worse. Because he trusted Nolan. Far more than he should. The rest of the evening passed quickly. Most employees eventually left. A smaller celebration continued at a rooftop lounge the company had rented. Music played softly. People laughed. The stress of the past months finally seemed gone. Milo normally hated company parties. This time he stayed. Mostly because Nolan stayed. Around midnight, the crowd had thinned considerably. Marcus was nowhere to be seen. Natalie had disappeared earlier. Only a handful of employees remained. Nolan stood near the railing overlooking the city. Milo joined him. The cool night air felt surprisingly peaceful. You know, Nolan said, for the first time in weeks, I don't have anything to fix. Give it 10 minutes. Nolan laughed. They stood there in comfortable silence. No work. No deadlines. No interruptions. Just the city lights below them. After several minutes, Nolan turned toward him. Milo did the same. The distance between them suddenly felt much smaller than it should have. Neither looked away. Neither seemed interested in moving. The moment stretched. Longer. And longer. For the first time, it felt possible. Not someday. Not eventually. Now. Milo could see uncertainty in Nolan's eyes. But he could also see hope. The same hope he felt himself. Then a phone started ringing. The sound shattered everything. Both men stepped back. Milo glanced at the screen. Marcus. He almost ignored it. Almost. But something about the timing felt wrong. He answered. Marcus sounded panicked. Where are you? What? We have a problem. The tone immediately changed everything. What happened? Get to the office. Now. The call ended. Within 30 minutes, Milo and Nolan were standing inside a conference room. Several executives had already arrived. Marcus stood near the screen. Natalie sat beside him. Everyone looked tense. Milo immediately knew this wasn't a small issue. One of the executives spoke first. Confidential company files were leaked tonight. The room went silent. Milo felt his stomach tighten. What files? Operational strategy documents. Vendor contracts. Internal projections. The executive clicked a remote. Several documents appeared on the screen. Milo recognized them instantly. Sensitive information. Very sensitive information. How bad is it? Bad. Another executive answered. Competitors already have access. The room grew even colder. Then the next slide appeared. Login records. Security reports. Access history. Milo studied the information and felt something inside him drop. The account responsible for downloading the files belonged to Nolan. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then Nolan shook his head. No. Everyone looked at him. No. That's impossible. The executive pointed at the screen. The downloads came from your credentials. I didn't do this. Marcus crossed his arms. Then how do you explain it? Nolan turned toward him. I don't know. His voice sounded genuinely shocked. Someone must have used my account. Natalie immediately spoke. That's convenient. Nolan looked at her. You think I did this? I think the evidence is pretty clear. Milo remained silent. Not because he believed it, but because the evidence truly was there. Every file, every timestamp, every login, everything pointed directly at Nolan. And Nolan noticed. He looked at Milo. Not the executives. Not Marcus. Not Natalie. Milo. Waiting. Hoping. Trusting. Say something. The words hit harder than Milo expected. Nolan's voice was quiet, but hurt. Milo opened his mouth, then stopped, because he didn't know what to say. And that hesitation was enough. Nolan saw it. The disappointment on his face was immediate. Pain replaced shock. You think I did it? No. But the answer came too late. Nolan shook his head. You don't know what to think. The room felt suffocating. Nolan. No. For the first time since they'd met, Nolan looked angry. Actually angry. After everything. His voice cracked slightly. After everything, you still don't trust me. Milo stepped forward. Nolan, listen. No. You listen. The younger man's eyes never left his. You told me people betrayed you before. Milo stayed silent. And now the second things get difficult, you look at me exactly the same way. The words landed like punches. Because part of them were true. Nolan laughed bitterly. I should have known. Then he turned and walked out. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything. The door slammed shut. The meeting eventually ended. Hours passed. Most employees went home. Milo remained alone in his office. Sometime after 3 a.m, Human Resources forwarded an email. A resignation letter. Nolan Mercer. Effective immediately. Milo stared at the screen for a very long time. Then something bothered him. One detail. One tiny detail. He opened the security system. Pulled up camera footage. Selected the night the files were downloaded. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Empty hallways. Dark offices. Cleaning staff. Then he noticed movement. Near midnight. A familiar figure. Natalie. Walking toward Nolan's workstation. Milo froze. He replayed the footage. Again. And again. Natalie stopped beside Nolan's desk. Looked around. Then disappeared into the camera's blind spot. Milo leaned closer. His heartbeat accelerating. Seconds later, the video abruptly glitched. Static flashed across the screen. The recording cut out. When it resumed several minutes later, Natalie was gone. Milo stared at the monitor. The office was completely silent. For the first time that night, something felt wrong. Very wrong. And somewhere out there, Nolan believed the one person he trusted most had chosen not to believe him. Milo looked back at the frozen image of Natalie on the screen. Then at the resignation letter still open on his monitor. And for the first time since the nightmare began, he realized one terrifying possibility. Maybe Nolan had been telling the truth all along. And that's where we'll leave Milo and Nolan for now. Just when they were finally beginning to trust each other and admit what was growing between them, everything fell apart. Nolan walked away believing Milo doubted him, while Milo may have just discovered that someone else has been pulling the strings from the shadows all along. Can he uncover the truth before it's too late? And will Nolan ever trust him again? If you can't wait to find out what happens next, the continuation of this story is already available on Patreon. You'll find the link in this video's description. Members get full access to complete stories, early releases, exclusive content, and the ability to binge entire series without waiting for future uploads. If you've been enjoying